Good afternoon, everyone. If you can hear me okay, just let me know and say hello. So, can you guys hear me all right? I know there's a slight delay between me speaking and you guys being able to respond. Okay, perfect. Thank you, Stella. All right, so just before we get started here, I just want to talk a little bit about your lesson that you guys received today and kind of what to expect in the next 2 weeks. So today you have a lesson on painting the hair. If you're a little bit behind or you're not quite there there yet, don't worry about it. Just kind of keep progressing through the videos, kind of whatever stage you're at. Our final critique is on the 15th, so we have next week's critique and then one final one after that. And next week is our final lesson, which is kind of hard to believe. So our final video lesson. So today you received the hair. Midweek I'm going to release painting the shirt, because these are kind of minor things, and I know some of you are up to speed and some of you aren't up to speed in terms of where you're at with your painting. So just keep pacing yourself. But I'm going to go ahead and release them. And then next weekend you will receive the final videos, which will be talking about hair. I'm sorry, not the hair, but the background and how to integrate the hair with the background if you need to go in and retouch that. And putting any final touches on the painting and kind of bringing that polish to it. And then I will have a follow-up video probably a week or so later. It'll just be a little bonus video that I'll release. It might be 2 weeks later. It depends on how long it takes my painting to dry. But I'm going to release one on how to varnish your painting, because a lot of people have questions about that. So I'll show you how I do it, and a couple of things like tips and tricks that help. A lot of the synthetic varnishes, there's kind of some pros and cons to them, so I'll talk about that as well during that video. So that's kind of us going to the end of the class. But for next week's critique, just make the corrections that we go over today and then try to push forward wherever you are at in terms of your layers. If you're playing catch up, you might have to do a little bit more work before next weekend's critique, and then the final critique where you'll want to at least maybe have the hair if you can't get to the background, or some of the less important areas, then that's okay too. So just it's most important that you spend all of your energy really focusing on the portrait. All right, so that was it. Hi Marianne, good to see you. I'm going to go ahead and just jump in, because critiques for the last class took a little bit longer because we're going more into detail and I'm spending a little more time with each person. So Brenda, are you in here? Oh, there you are. Perfect. So I'm just about to start yours. And just so everyone knows, like if you're still concentrating heavily on the face, which most of you should be by next weekend for our next critique, send me a close-up kind of like this. You can also be a little bit zoomed out. That's fine too. But because we're getting into like the little nitty-gritty details, it will help me see your more accurate colors. So just get your camera a little bit up close. There will be some subtle distortion that just happens when you bring your camera really close. But so long as most of your drawing is there, I'm not going to make you correct those kind of things. We're going to just talk about the details and the color and that sort of thing. So Brenda, let's talk a little bit about, first let me know, how does the color look and the values look on your picture? Does it feel pretty accurate to, it's not like too pink or too yellow or maybe too saturated or anything? I just want to know. Oh, it's perfect? Okay, good. Yeah, it looks like a good picture. It looks pretty balanced. So this picture here is a little blurry. I think it's because I've I've made the picture big and small repeatedly over time, but so some things should probably be a little more in focus than they are here, but in the photo reference. Okay, so the first thing I want to address, I think, is the mouth. It's very subtle, but I think we need to make a few changes there. And then we'll talk about maybe refining a little bit in the eyes and some of these transitions that you see here. Let me grab my ink pen here. So before you go in and you add any glazing or anything like that for the final, and like those highlights for the final layer, you want to make sure that your transitions in areas like here and here don't have real abrupt hard edges. They should kind of flow a little bit more gradually. You can see here this edge is maybe a little bit more broken through the middle. So you might take a mid-tone that's somewhere between these two and lightly scumble it across the form in this direction. And I'll do a paint over so that you can see what I mean too, but I'm going to just describe this with line in the beginning. Same thing here. You can see that your transition is pretty uniform in terms of the position of the green, and she has a little bit more of a dance with her shape. So I think that's really going to help pull it to a little bit more of her likeness. So something to, and you can see when it's zoomed in, you can see those shape differences a bit more obvious. So I think the biggest one that I see is that you could probably open up the light on the cheek just a little bit, not real bright. It's probably going to be like a darker mid-tone like you have up here. But then it's going to cut in, and you can kind of see on the reference here that you have these points, and I'll do this in white so it's a little easier to see. You have this point, and this point. And if we look at where this line kind of leads to that, and then it dances to this one, and then it kind of, I guess we could consider that another point too. But if you look at how far in this is, it lines up with her iris. And yours, before it starts to angle down, is out in here. So on the outer corner of the eye. So what we want to do is bring this corner in, and you can see it kind of peaks in about the level of the, just a little bit above the mouth. So we're going to bring that in to about there. And we're talking about the shadow. We're kind of moving. Yeah, I know that shadow shape, it's really subtle the way it kind of dances in and out. And you're not the only one that's, you know, kind of struggled with positioning it. And sometimes that just happens because when we do our first block in, you do risk losing some of your drawing. And that can happen. And it's okay. Sometimes you do 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And but once you lock in that shadow shape and you get those transitions across, the rest is really easy. So the shadow shapes are kind of that, they're part of that structure that we feel in the face. And if we don't get them right, the whole portrait, it doesn't look like the model, and then the whole portrait starts to slowly kind of fall apart. And even though it might feel like going back to basics, it's going to make the biggest change for your painting in terms of capturing her likeness. So we have that point there, and I think it could be a little, maybe a little lower. So it's going to be something like that. Opens up a little bit here. And you can kind of see that actually maybe it comes up a little higher before it dances in over there. Let me adjust this here at the top. And I think I sense that your shadow kind of does this shape. It's hard to tell just because your shadow does get a little lighter and warmer towards the top. But you can see hers definitely does that. And it kind of comes up like this and dances back like that. So that's the kind of shape we want to start achieving in the painting. And I think I get the feeling you have that temple edge in the right spot. So I'll just clean up some of this. And I tend to go with angles just because curves tend to get exaggerated when we paint. So if I'm going back to reestablishing a shape, sometimes I go back to that kind of angular stage, if you remember when we first started drawing. Okay, so then this drops down and there's this other little peak that kind of angles in towards the mouth here. I'm only going to sketch this out and then I'll do a paint over for you on a different layer. So you'll have both the linear edit and the tonal edit. Okay, so then this comes in and you can see the proximity to the mouth and kind of where that sits in relationship to the eye as well. So just keeping that in mind. Probably swings in just a little bit more. And before it drops down. And I feel like you do have this point in the correct spot. So that's where I feel like things start to read. But the darkest part of the shadow comes up a little higher on this part of the chin. And I think what happened is your green kind of took over where your brown should be. So we just need to work on nudging some of that around just to make sure we start to get a little closer to her specific shape. I'm going to look at a couple of other shapes that are going to help. I do feel like the bend in this nose is making her nose feel a little off-center subtly. And I think it has to do with where this shadow comes over. Because you can see there's this dance between this shape and that one. And I can see you have that shape there. So we just need to push this over that arc a little higher. And that's going to open up some room for that nostril too. I think you actually have the nostril in the right spot. I think that shadow shape just got a little bit small and then it made the nose feel a little more off-center. So your shadow shape for the septum of the nose is going to come over. And then that cast shadow branches off and it's maybe just a little longer, not fatter. I think you have the right width across here. So I think I would make that cast shadow a little longer, and that's going to help close this space and get that space correct. And we don't realize these things, the little things that add up, because if the nose shape is slightly off, then it influences how we approach the mouth shape, for example. So these little shape adjustments are going to add up. I would make sure you're not cutting this too straight. Maybe give a slight curve to the light here, like push that mid-tone over a little bit. And then I think you pick up your shadow shape in the right spot up here. So I think it's just a matter of maybe making this feel a little more graduated and subtle as that pushes over. And that'll give her that little cute ball of the nose shape that she has. Your width of the nose seems good otherwise. You could probably push, see that little subtle line here. I think yours might be a touch wide. Or maybe you just need to carry more mid-tone up onto the nose. So that way it doesn't feel like this, I'm sensing this straight line here. And I see a sense of that, but I feel like the edge maybe gets more lost somewhere through the middle. So you could try carrying some pinker kind of tones up through this section. That way that highlight, when you place it, is nice and bright. And you can probably push that in just a touch so that way you have room to carry this little light in. See, there's like those two little scoop shapes. So let's look down into the mouth a little bit. I feel like you're really close. Where you have this line could probably be a little lower. or maybe just more clear on what the shadow shape is on that underside of the lip, where that deep crease is. She kind of has more of a square lip here. You can see it kind of takes on a little more of a squareness. So maybe make that angle a little more straight. And actually, I feel when I'm kind of tracing over this, I'm feeling a sense that your line here is actually the right length and the position is good where you have this little shape, but where you have this come up is almost too soon. I would maybe trim that right there. This looks good, that looks good, the other side looks good. So maybe just that little corner there, just push a little light in there. And that's going to capture her shape a little more accurately. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So as far as like linear drawing edits that I want to point out. So now looking to the eyes here, when you go in to refine this eye, just look at your spacing here to here and here. I feel like maybe you could trim a tiny bit off this bottom part. Make it slightly more kind of elliptical. It's a little longer than it is wide. And I think some of that is just maybe clarifying what's happening in the eye. And I'll talk about that, how to do that tonally. And the same goes for this one. Just subtly, to get her to look up more, it's going to close off towards the bottom a little more quickly. It's not a big difference, but I think it'll help. Maybe this pupil could be a little taller and just more defined there. Your eye shape here looks good. This could just, when you go in to put in that darker crease, maybe just flatten this part of the shape out a little bit. And that's going to imitate this shape that you see here slightly. And it'll kind of mimic what we see over here, and it'll look a little bit more like her. So those are my only suggestions. The main one I think is that's going to make the biggest difference is getting that shadow shape into the correct position. It's going to completely transform the portrait. So what I'd like to do is do a paint over. I think your colors, by the way, are looking really nice. I love the cool transition here, the green transitioning into there. You have like warmer spots and kind of cooler pink. It's creating a lot of interest. You have these really nice violets in here. The only thing I think is maybe pushing some of the darks in the eyes, a little more contrast, and don't be afraid to go darker with this red so her eyes don't look so much red, but you know, nice and deep. So we'll work on that in the paint over, and I'll show you what I mean. So I'll address those areas. So what we're going to do with the paint over is, of course, start with that shadow color. And you actually have a really nice shadow color in here. It's nice and rich, this kind of red, and you have a darker one in here. And you'll notice on the photo that she has, let me pull this away, it's lighter towards the bottom down here, and it gets darker up towards the top. Let me draw with white here real quick. So like down in this area it's lighter, and then it gets darker towards the top of the jawline there. So I think what's going to help is just using like the light brown that you have here. Maybe you could go a little darker with it and maybe paint just a little more solid. So you don't have to keep the shadow like a wash necessarily or a glaze. You can paint it a little bit more opaquely. So long as you don't have white in there, it's fine. Burnt sienna is a decent opaque color. You can also make a nice brown using cadmium red, a little ultramarine blue, and a touch of yellow ochre. Obviously, the more red and blue you have, the more red-brown it's going to be. So you can see how just bringing that shape a little bit more in and a little more solid, going a little darker up here. And then I'm going to go ahead and take that same warm brown here. Make sure your shadow colors in the nose are not going green. There's green in like the transitions, but notice how warm that tone is under here. It's kind of a warm reflected light. I'm going to get a darker color here. Just to make sure you don't lose that nostril there. So there we have these solid shapes, and of course those edges where they end are a little bit abrupt. She does have maybe a touch more, like if you were making this color, you maybe add a little touch more yellow ochre to the color down here to give a little more of that reflected color under the jaw. Okay, so, and maybe, I can't tell if this is green or if it's just sunk in, but make sure you have that nice warm, rich red brown in this shadow, and it does connect here. It's subtle, but it connects. And it connects up to the brow too. So just getting that nice and solid. So let me take away the lines now, and we'll work on building out those transitions. Of course, you might find yourself needing to go in and darken the hair to make sure you don't lose that jawline. You can enhance the reflected light a little bit, but I would wait to do that because watch the hair video that I released today, and you'll see that when I had added those rich darks in the hair that went even darker than my first umber underpainting, I didn't need to add reflected light into my shadows because they ended up being light enough as they were. So it kind of depends on how your painting ended up, if it was dark enough to begin with. So once you move that shape into place, I'm going to just modify this a little bit. You want to look at where the form starts to feel like it pools, like the tension almost pools, or there's like an overlap, a sense of overlapping form. And two examples of those areas is right here and right here, where the cusp of the cheekbone kind of comes in, and we have that fullness to the cheek, and then we have this here. So that's what we want to emphasize in your painting. And what I would do is take these kind of olive tones that you used, and you're basically going to be pushing those out a little bit. So once you've repainted your shadow edge, you have an opportunity to work on some of those transitions. And what I often find is if I tile the two, and she has like a kind of if you take the red that you have there but add a little blue to it, you'll end up with a deeper shade of almost a red violet. Nothing too saturated, but you want to put that right next to that shadow edge near the cheekbone, because then it's going to see how that rounds it over. And some of that starts to carry down into this green kind of gradually. But one thing you'll notice is that there's a sense of like the pull of the form. So you might end up taking some of that shadow color and just blending it. You want your shadow shapes to be clear, but you want to have those subtle transitions as well. So you might end up finding that you need to make something between the shadow color and whatever color you're trying to blend it into. Mix as many nuanced colors as you need in order to get in there and create those smoother forms. And getting that form, see how it's kind of, that form is overlapping and pulling in from this shadow and kind of in this direction. It doesn't happen everywhere. You get down here and it's a little bit more abrupt, but then we have that form pulling across the chin as well. And you actually have quite a bit of that in your painting as it is. I do think you could go in with your brown and maybe emphasize the dark here, kind of that trail. Allow there to be a little bit of a break, maybe across the middle of the form. And sometimes it takes a couple of attempts to get, you know, these shapes to work together. Oftentimes I find, it depends on the painting, but I'll find myself repainting a passage a couple of times until I get a sense of it feeling correct. So you can see now, let me take that away here, how that's, not only it's adding drama, but it's also pulling more attention to the lights, and your lights are getting more impact because there's more transitions and darks on the more shadowy side, more of the halftones. And often what happens when you feel like your skin tones are bleached out, or you know, you're lacking that structure, it's often in this area, from the shadow to that light. So you could even look at how you could use some of the skin tones a little darker in some of these areas. That's a little extreme, but to help you soften the edge of where the mouth kind of leads in. There's a little more light that kind of carries down here, but you want to be careful because if you compare the value like right here, and then we compare the value right here, there's a big distinction, a big distinction. And even if you compared the values like right here where we see that lighter line on the lip, let's compare that one to the value of the gray beneath it, or the value out here. You can see that these are almost the same value, but right now you have them maybe a little more distinct. So you might try softening that a little bit and then making your pink for that lower rim a little darker. What's going to help it stand out is that you have that plane a little bit darker as well. More of a solid color. And there's a little bit of light that kind of peeks over the top. But it helps to kind of soften and round out that edge. Moving away from the mouth, going up into the eye socket, kind of in this transition area. One thing that helps is notice that This form on the lid starts off really light, but then it ends up almost nearly black on this far side. That's really going to give us, and you have it real light here, so that's probably one of the reasons why this feels kind of ambiguous and you couldn't go much darker there to transition your shadow right here. So so as a result, you lightened your shadow and kind of it has like a trickle down effect. So one thing that will help is to go in and take your shadow color, just your general shadow color, and start to build a gradation for that orb of the eye. The light carries over to about there, but you can see it gradually gets darker. So you might have a little light here. So you get that nice smooth gradation going over into that corner. But by the time it gets to this corner, it's nice and dark, and you can see that that color also wraps down in here. It's just a little touch lighter, maybe has a little bit more of an opacity to it. And now that we have that dark dramatic light, you can see how your underplane for the eye needs to go into a deeper red. And we're concentrating on the shadow side because I feel like your light side looks pretty good. So you want to make this, even though it's lighter than this color out here for the crease and the eyelid, this under here should be a shadow. It gets a little lighter towards the inner corner because there's some reflection of light coming into there. But notice how pushing that darker and then having this darker edge out here, now we can start to feel how some of the forms like in the eye could be more described. Like the whites of the eyes there are quite dark, and that's what helps her eye feel more illuminated. And it's kind of counterintuitive to want to put a dark color on what we consider the whites of the eyes. But that's exactly what's happening. And oftentimes when we're not sure how to handle an area, we paint what we know and not what we see. And that's often when we end up struggling the most, is because we're not actually paying attention to, and we don't realize it, it's like almost subconscious. We kind of default into painting what we think we know to be true and not actually what we're seeing. But that adds a whole level of volume to that eye. And the reason we're seeing her iris is because it's illuminated by the light hitting the highlight here and passing through and illuminating that other far side. And I think you have plenty of light in there, and that looks good. But you need to maybe go a little darker up here towards the top, pick a deeper green, and don't be afraid to push this into a slightly, you don't want it as black as the pupil, but you'll want it a little bit darker. And then you can clarify that pupil there. And there might be an area right through the middle up through the top here where it gets even darker and harder to see. And I'll show you what I mean by trimming that eye just a little bit more elliptical. And it always helps to just put a little more shadow right beneath that highlight. Get that subtle gradient, and then when you put that highlight on, nice and sharp, and then you get that real lovely illumination to the eye. I realize her irises are a little bit more narrow, so it's harder to see some of this stuff, but these are some of the things that you start to notice when you paint a lot from life, and you implement them into your work when you work from photos. And it just adds even more of that lifelike kind of quality. All right, so so far, do you have any questions? I hope I'm not overwhelming you with too many changes. I really think for next week, I want you to concentrate on this shadow edge and not worry about the individual features as much, with the exception of getting this shadow shape on the nose reestablished. Obviously, you'll want to have a softer edge on that shadow, so when you repaint it, you'll do kind of the same process. You'll have to go in and blend those edges and make sure they're nice and subtle in their transition, and then carry that. I think if you took kind of like a rosy pink and just pushed it over on this a little bit, right around this edge, and maybe, like we had talked about, pull a little bit more pink in around here. It's going to add a little more color to that nose and get it to pop forward. Okay, good. I'm glad I'm not overwhelming you. I know I'm listing a lot of different things, so if you're like, that's enough for me to correct, and just let me know, and I can stop, and you can always check in with me midweek. So I'm going to go ahead and finish out a little bit on this eye. The other eye will need similar adjustments, but I'm not going to do necessarily a paint over because the drawing is correct in the eye on this side here. This eye right here. That one looks good. I think you would just basically implement some of the same concepts, like deepening the dark up in the upper portion of the lid, going a little darker maybe with your underplane, emphasizing some of those things. So you can see how, and for example, that inner corner of her whites of the eye is a little darker. So those type of things you'll incorporate. So the other part is just building maybe a little bit more clarity to the shape of the tear duct and softening some of these transitions down in this area. So we want to avoid the temptation to outline the eye. And we do this with the lips and the features, I think, because we want to see that clarity, but it's really important to take note of where lost and found edges are. So one thing that you want to remember to think about is, just like this eye has a transition dark to light here, we're going to have the same thing down here, dark to light, going this direction. So looking at this inner corner, we do have some descriptive shapes. I think you're pretty good, but maybe you need to go in with a darker red and just describe this inner. I think this will happen kind of when you go in and define a little bit. It's like there's a dark shape and then it has a little bit of a lighter shape on the outside. And I realize there's a lot going on there and it's kind of hard to decipher. But if you make sure that tone out here is just a little lighter, so it takes on a softer edge. And then underneath that, you have that darker red accent. It's just a little shape right there. You're going to describe that eye a little bit more accurate in shape. Okay, because we have almost two forms happening there. There's the deeper part of the membrane of the eye, and then there's the under shelf of the eye. And that under shelf is what's getting that reflected light, so it is a little lighter there than it is over on this side. But then behind that, or underneath that, is this deeper kind of part of the membrane that it's where the tear duct itself, and I'm going to maybe go a little deeper with that, where the tear duct itself starts to branch out. But then the tear duct membrane, it actually takes on a lighter pink, so it's not dark everywhere because the light comes in and filters into that shape. So then I would take a lighter pink and start to scumble a little bit in here. Don't be afraid of losing that outline. What actually defines these forms is more highlights rather than darks. So you have a highlight here and then you have a little highlight on the inside, and that's what creates that illusion of that line that you see here. So rather than creating that line here with a dark, we're actually describing it by adding highlights up here and below it, if that makes sense. And you'll notice as this rounds into the inner corner, we see less of this top shelf, and so this kind of curls up. So I think you could probably bring that up a little higher. It's almost like a little ribbon shape. But then it fades off rather quickly into a lighter tone. So we get kind of a lost edge there, where it's not as easily described. Okay, so I just want you to concentrate on, before you get into the eye will be something you kind of do later. Let me make some notes here. So there's your drawing corrections, but concentrate on getting these areas drawn in into the correct position. Then I would jump to the nose, and of course then you can go in and start to render on the eye, and this is the eye that needs, I think, the most changes because it needs to be given a little bit more dimension to push back those values. And a lot of times we are just too hesitant to put those dramatic darks in, like the whites of the eyes, or areas we know aren't technically they're whites. Yes, whites of the eyes are white, but in taking into account form, they're actually not. Does that make sense? Okay, so those are some of the things I want you to just work on. Concentrate on that for our next critique. Get as much of that part done before you worry about your lights, because I feel like the colors in your lights are really beautiful and you're like pretty much there. Developing a little more clarity in the mouth and the eyes is going to bring the portrait a lot further, but this shadow shape it like takes more precedence. It's a little more important to get this handled because it lends itself to that overall sense of the light moving across the form. Do you have any questions, Brenda? You're very welcome. So when I send you the critique after class, I'll send you the line drawings just so you can see where things should be placed, and you can it'll help you kind of sketch it out, and then I'll send you the paint over without the lines. That way you can kind of see some of the more nuanced and what the finished effect should be. Alrighty. Good work. And your colors, like I said, and the lights are really beautiful. You have that variety, so let's just enhance them by pushing those darks. All right, Randy, are you here? I believe you sent me a close-up of the face as well, so I'm probably going to work from this more, but I just wanted to ask you if the color feels accurate if you're here. My feeling is that the color has a little too much orange in it. That's just my general feeling. But I wanted to know here what your thoughts were on that. All right, so, and also I can't quite tell if this is sinking in or if it's the actual color that you've placed in the jawline. Because from the other picture, it almost looks more brownish. It's just a little hard to tell. So I just wanted to clarify those things. Now she does have quite an illuminated reflected light here in her shadow, but I do feel like you might have pushed it a little bit too light. Let me zoom in here on the portrait. So I can concentrate on the face. Okay, so yeah, I think we need to go maybe a little bit warmer with your shadow. And a little bit darker. And if it's sinking in, and this is partly due to the photo being so light, then you can take that into account. But I do think that adding a little bit, and I'm going for the lighter color right now, and then going in and adding that nice rich dark behind that jawline. And she gets very, very red up towards the top here, so it almost gets a little darker towards the top, a little bit more red. And there is some variation to this shadow shape that could use a little bit of work. So instead of having it just this kind of dramatic straight line, look at where the form feels like it pulls in. Like here is a good spot, and then like here. And there's even little ones kind of in and out along the lower jaw right through this section here. So I think one of the main ones that's important to be sure to note is the one for the cheekbone. It pulls in just a little bit more. And sometimes it's mid-tone, but it's also a slight deviation in the shadow shape. And then it comes down, and then it comes in. Kind of does this little dance down the form. And that's going to create a little more interest to that shape. And then she has another shadow coming in from the hairline here for the temple. And it's not as dramatic or solid because there are some darker hues right next to it. So you will need to go a little darker in the midtones next to it, but that's going to help push that form a little bit more. From this angle, we see that more of the shadow side. So than in the angle I'm painting. We're more on the light side of her for my angle. And so you're going to want to really emphasize your darks, those darker midtones. Don't be afraid to go, even if you are a little bit warmer, if I even took your color that you have here, but I just brought it down a little bit deeper, but I think you could actually cool that off just a touch, right where it meets the shadow. And there's almost some lost edges that happen right in here because there's that form is pulling up a little bit. I'm going to find a happy middle just because your colors are coming across so warm. I don't want to paint over in too dark of a color or too cool of a color. So I think introducing some cooler pinks in this cheek might be nice, but maybe a little bit more saturated right through here. And as this pulls back, it gets more into those gray violets, which you do have in your skin tones. So I think it's just a matter of pulling that mid-tone out a little bit further. It connects to that eye socket. So don't be afraid to push that a little bit more. So that way that form feels like it just slowly sinks back. She does have a little bit more of an abrupt highlight there, but there should be maybe some level of softness to the transition. So let me erase some of what I've done here to soften that. Okay, so we're sculpting that cheek, and I know it feels really, really strong right now, but we haven't gone down and added those darks for the lower part of the jaw, which are more in these kind of grays. And you have it here, but I think it just needs to be pulled out a little further. Look at how this form pulls into the corner of the mouth. This one pulls into that lower lip. And then there's more of it on this side plane of the chin, because your lights are bright enough. And often what people are tempted to do is to go brighter with the highlights, and sometimes that is what's needed. Like in my painting, I needed to go lighter. But if you find that you're pretty much close to pure white, as close as you can get, and you're finding that you put it on and those highlights just don't have enough impact, it's probably because you have too light of values everywhere and you didn't go dark enough with your midtones and those transitions from the shadow side. So that's something it's kind of like a cue for you to go in and maybe deepen some of these and re-examine some of these side plane halftones that are right next to the shadow edge. So I'm going back in with the shadow color here, just modulating that edge. Creates a little more interest instead of it being just one solid form. Her mouth might have gotten a touch wide here. Let's look at where that sits. In relationship to, well, that's too fat of a line. Hold on. Okay, so your corner front part of the eye is here. I don't know if I would shorten it that much, but maybe that is what it needs. Let's just try it and see what happens. Take some of the skin tone that's from this area and just trim it just a little bit. Yeah, that's a little bit closer. And notice how cool this upper lip area is. It's very, very blue. It doesn't take on much pink in this lower half, so except for maybe a few areas in the chin. This is that green zone. And if you look at Dutch paintings, they really emphasize this. Look at Rembrandt, look at Van Dyck. And it creates a really nice kind of subtlety to the form. Maybe find something to soften that transition there. Okay, so I want you to concentrate on that primarily. And maybe that's going to kind of take the painting quite far, but looking at, position of the hair, I feel like the forehead got maybe a little tall through here. Her hairline comes in maybe a little more quickly before it comes back. And then this part comes down, and you could actually bring the hair forward a little bit. It comes down and meets where that shadow tucks in from the cheek. And then this side of the mouth also got a little wide. The actual corner of her mouth almost lines up with the tip of her nose. So it's really foreshortened, and that's probably what's throwing it off a little bit. So go a little bit shorter with that position of the corner of the mouth. The shape you have here is pretty good otherwise. Maybe this little arc here for the Cupid's bow can come forward just a little bit, bring it a little closer to the other one. And because you go in and darken your shadow here, you're going to have to darken your cast shadow as well, at least a little bit, and go warmer with it. And especially in this eye socket, she has quite a bit of warmth in there as well. So you'll want to kind of make those a little bit more dramatic. And you'll find yourself going into this eye socket to make some of those adjustments as well. Okay, so I'm going to leave it at that, just because at the moment that's a lot of work to do. And if you kind of start kind of midweek and you find that you want to move forward but you want more feedback, just send me a picture by email. You can post it in the forum too, but if you want a little bit more detailed critique, then send me another email and I can do either another paint over, or I can just point out a few things to pay attention to. All right? Yeah, just kind of concentrate on that area. And if you have any follow-up questions, of course, just reach out to me. All right. Oh, hey, Colin. Glad you can make it. Okay, Tammy, are you here, Tammy? I wanted to ask you if the picture feels a little warm. It does to me. So I wanted to be able to make a few adjustments to that. I feel like it's maybe a touch saturated, and maybe the color is a little red. So I still have my notes from last time, and I think most of them were about kind of defining some of the forms, and of course we talked about correcting some of the shapes in the eyes. Oh, there you are. So let me take a closer look here, and if you could next week, maybe I'll take out some more of that color here. But if you could next week, send me a close-up of the face. That way I can, not worry about too much of what's going on out here. Just so I can get into some of the more accurate colors, but also some of the forms so they don't break down when I zoom in so much. All right, let me take out some of that color here. I'm thinking it might be saturation. Sometimes the saturation in photos is just a little bit more than what we want. Is that feeling a little bit closer? Okay, I think what I'm going to do is just zoom this in here so I can get into the face a little bit more in depth. Oh, I did have a zoom in on the face too, right here. So, okay. Hold on, let me make a few adjustments just so it's easier for critiquing. Bring this in closer together. Okay, so so you had worked a bit on the eyes. I think that's what we had talked about last time, was correcting some of the shape. This right eye still feels a little small for this model. So I'm thinking maybe we need to work on opening the eyes up just a touch. Let me show you what I mean here. Well, let me do this just first in black, just so it's real easy to see. So when I look at this eye here, I'm looking at this spacing. And I feel like you're really close, but if you kind of just brought this open a little bit more before you dropped it down. And what you could even do is just make this, like if you took this underplane color and just added a kind of another layer pushing out, it would start to see how that kind of gives the illusion that her eye is slightly more open. That's kind of what we're wanting. And I think where this dark is, you can push that to the left, and that makes her eye feel a little bit bigger. I think the bottom seems okay. Although where this iris meets the lower rim on this side, you want to make sure we see almost that full cusp of that iris, and that's going to push down this shape a little bit. So that shape's going to close off a little lower. And I think that already kind of helps to open up the eye a little bit. And perhaps that's what needs to happen on this left eye as well, is taking that red underplane color and just opening up how much of it we see, bringing it up a little bit. Don't be afraid to make it a little bit more thick. That will mean that you need to kind of nudge this up, but these are small increments, but they kind of add up. So I'm just doing this in a solid color so you can see linear wise how much to change it. Same thing with this one actually. I think we need to open that up just on this inside. She has a very full lid in that beginning, so I'm just doing it in a drawing color. I'll do a more proper paint over after, but I just want to show you drawing wise what that effect does to open up her eyes a little bit more. Same thing goes for that inner corner effect here. Maybe bringing rounding out that shape. So you can see that subtle difference. It just gives her eyes a little more presence in the portrait. Okay, so that's probably the main thing I would suggest. There's a few subtle things like in the mouth, the way this right corner drops. Right now yours is kind of more straight, and I feel like this corner here, almost from this point drops a little more dramatically. And almost where you have the lip placed is fine on the upper lip. And then you just want to make sure that this, maybe this point comes up a little bit more obvious. So right now, instead of having it feel kind of rounded, give that a little bit more of a pointed space there. This one side is fine on the left. So I think it's just this one here. It just needs a little tweak. You have some nice transitions in here. I can't tell if some details getting lost in here just because the photo breaks down a little bit when I zoom in. So Tammy, if you could send me a close-up either after you make the eye corrections, or if you you could even send it to me like tomorrow, and I can look at this area a little more carefully and give you some suggestions and even do a little paint over. But one thing I'm noticing is that this shape feels like it got a little generic here, like we have like this scoop feeling, and I think you're pretty much spot on here, but this can open up a little bit. And when we get down in here, maybe you just need to add a little peak there, because I feel like this part's okay. So maybe defining a little bit more right through this section, bringing that shadow up in that peak is going to help. I think maybe even your chin might be okay. If you wanted, Tammy, if you wanted me to look at it tonight, you could probably send it and I might be able to get around to it. If not, though, I'll definitely take a look tomorrow and send you my suggestion. I just want to make sure like these transitions aren't real choppy, because once you go in and start glazing, it kind of enhances that. Like if there's any unevenness in the transitions or something jumps too quickly in terms of an edge, then the glazing and it tends to like enhance that effect. And we don't want that, obviously, if it still needs correcting. So I can kind of advise you a little better on that. I do see really nice soft edges here and here, so I'm happy with those areas. The edge along the neck here, I know we haven't gone too much into the neck, but it feels a little razor sharp. So I would take maybe like a dark halftone, maybe something even between the hair color and the skin color, and just, you know, do a tile and then blend it out, and that will help the neck feel like it wraps back towards that dark, kind of like what you did here. I can see it in this jawline. That's a much better kind of, it's a subtle difference, but I can see that softness there. And I would even soften maybe further some of your transitions along the hairline. Just make them a little bit more fuzzy. Then transitions in the nose look good. Are they this green in person? Because I know it's coming across as really, really green, but I'm wondering if that's because when I made the color correction to take it away from red, it's like emphasizing the green. But does it look really, really green like that in person? If it does, or when you send me the close-up, I could probably see that too. But if it does, you might try going a little more maybe pink mauve tone in there instead. Same value, but a little bit more rosy. Okay, I think that's pretty much it. I want you to correct that shape and then work on this shape here in the jawline and the eyes as far as drawing goes. Let's talk a little bit maybe about paint over. There aren't too many suggestions just because the picture is a little bit breaks down. It's not green. Okay, so maybe send me a close-up of the face. Sometimes when we take pictures close up, the camera, the phone camera, or whether you're using a phone camera or a Nikon, or like a DSLR, or even just a point and shoot camera, when you get in a little bit closer and you try and do the white balance, it tends to have an easier time capturing the colors. When you zoom out is when it's trying to merge, you know, and simplify the colors, and then things can kind of get skewed. So I think actually I'm going to wait, Tammy, since if you could send me that other close-up, I'll give you some notes on color. I'll basically do a little paint over, and then I'll write out some of the things that I think need to adjust, just because I don't want to tell you to change a bunch of things if it's not really looking like this in person. Is that okay? So for now, you can concentrate just on those drawing corrections, and then we'll talk about color whenever you give me that close-up. Okay, perfect. All right, sounds good. Yeah, it's looking really nice. Just I think bringing those a little more attention to those eyes is going to make a big difference. Okay, Alexandra, are you here? So next week, also just a note for everyone watching, next week, send me a close-up kind of like this if you can, because I'll be able to see more accurate transitions. I can see some of your color and texture and that sort of thing. So it's going to help me give, especially as you start getting in some of the details like she has here, like the eyelashes, I'll be able to see those details a little bit better and give you more accurate feedback. You're welcome, Tammy. That's fine, Tammy. And you don't need to make the corrections 100% before you send it to me. If you just want some remarks, additional remarks on color, you can try and send me just a picture tomorrow as it is now. Just a close-up like you see here. And I can give you a few more like specific pointers. You're welcome. Yeah, no problem. Okay, so, oh, didn't mean to click out of that. So Alexandra, I don't think you're in here, but this is looking really nice. I do like being able to see some of the texture here, so I can see where you're kind of enhancing some of your thickness and the highlights. You have some of the eyelashes painted in. There's only a few areas where I feel like the forms start to fall a little bit flat, and I think you could really enhance that. You also sent me actually some close-ups of the mouth. So if you guys want to do that for me next week too, if you've developed the features and you want to send me some close-ups, like in this picture, you can definitely see that turquoise blue kind of enhancement in the corners of the eyes. That looks really nice. I'm just looking between these two here. So I can see a little more subtlety than comes across in this part, but I think the lower jaw area starts to fall, like I said, just a little bit flat through the form. Right in here and here, these transitions. It's kind of making this area feel like a flat kind of block. So maybe enhancing some of the darks. like in here, she has that kind of darkest shadow. I could almost take your shadowy color right in here and start to push this form and accentuate it a little bit. And the same goes for up here where this transitions into the lip. Just a slight enhancement is going to keep it from flattening out. And then as this curls down towards your shadow edge, you're going to want a little more of a broken edge by bringing that mid-tone a little bit stronger. It becomes less obvious as the corner of the chin moves over in this direction. And you might also look at some having a little bit more, I think we're kind of missing this little dance in the shadow shape. You can see it happens right kind of meeting the corner of the mouth, so it's right around here where it can kind of come up a little bit. And then this is a little more narrow. So just work on moving that shape over, and it's going to look a little bit more like her. And you'll notice there's also this pool of tone coming in here. So I always like to look at where the transitions feel like they're pulling in. Your colors are spot on, so I would just keep, they're looking really good, so keep kind of pulling that same color that you have like up here in the transition for the cheek area, and then just instead pull it over a little bit more. It almost kind of comes over and slightly connects to the mouth. It's not as light in this little section. It's a very delicate area, so I realize that it's, you know, very nuanced. Like you think it's light, and then you look closer and you realize it has a little more dark to it, but then she has this light up here, but it almost feels like it carries down, but it's not as strong. She does have a tiny light here, which you're pretty good with. Maybe make it just a little bit softer. So I think that starts to enhance the lower form. I do feel like your highlights on the chin are competing with the highlights kind of everywhere else in the face, and I would tone them back just a little bit. Notice that they're like a little bit more of a frosted pink, so you might try going a little more pink with them and then building up more of that rosy kind of mid-tone. You almost have some of that color in here, bringing it up higher and focusing it more on the right side. It should be more dominant than the white area. I mean, she has that little specular highlight there, but all the other colors around it are a little bit darker mid-tone. And you might just work on maybe smoothing out this transition to this light up here by the lip, using that same mid-tone. You might find after you add some more pink, you have to carry some of this gray or maybe even a violet over a little bit. And it's just creating more of that feeling of that fall off of light. She also has a little more of that deeper gray right where that chin overlaps before it tucks under, right in here. I always think of it as like overlapping, or where the form kind of pulls in. and you get a little bit more of a nuanced edge or shape. Your edge maybe transitioning from here to here is a little abrupt, so just work on softening that edge by taking a little bit of your light pink and just, not real light, just kind of that middle value pink, and just scumbling it over that edge. Sometimes it takes very little work to get that to read. You want to watch having such a sharp edge right here. So you might think about finding a value that's something in between and just doing a very thin tile. Let me find a color and just bring it down in value. So you could even take just the skin tone and bring it down in value and just closer to that hair value. To help soften that edge just slightly. You might even make that little mini shadow just a little bit more narrow. You have some nice brushwork happening in here. If you want to get more subtle with some of the eyes, you might just soften out some edges like in here. Make sure, and it's a little saturated for her eye color. She has a little bit more of like an olive tone. If you want to exaggerate that color, that's fine, but maybe introduce a little bit more of a gray-green around that more turquoise color. And it kind of helps balance it out. So I would suggest doing the same over here. And maybe just soften out any edges that are jumping too much. Her iris on the left feels a little smaller than what you have on the right side. On the right, or I mean on our right. So this eye feels pretty good, but this one feels a little bit small in the iris itself. So you might end up opening it up just a little bit on the left and just a touch on both sides, on the right side of it, just to get it to be about the same size as that one. Nice lost edge in the lip here, that looks nice. You might consider, just look at this shape a little more carefully. She has a little dip down before her lip comes up there. I struggled with this area as well. I kind of ended up repainting it and just going over it and over it, trying to get that shape, that very specific shape to her lip. But you might consider maybe shortening that a little bit. And don't go in with your brightest color like what you have out here. Start with like a slightly darker, more gray skin tone to make the adjustment, and then you can build the brightness into it. Maybe just soften that little curl in the lip. And these are very, very specific small things. The lip might be a little saturated for these shadowy colors. While you want the saturation, there are going to be kind of more desaturated areas. So if they get too red everywhere, it's going to look like she's wearing lipstick. So maybe look at where you could maybe tone some colors back. Actually, I think the upper lip has a nice range to it. Maybe it's just that this right side can go darker and slightly cooler just overall. And maybe find a paler pink to just soften that top of the form. You want to find, it's fine to have, you know, texture in the lips, but we tend to see it more around the highlights, and if you have texture everywhere, then it kind of overwhelms the eye a little bit. So make sure you find areas of smooth and areas of you know, more crisp detail and texture and variation. Okay, so those are my suggestions. This looks really nice. So I would just work on some of those subtle changes, as you can see here. I'll send you the paint over. And if you have any follow-up questions, just shoot me an email. Really nice work. All right, Colin, you're up. You still in here? Okay, so before we get started, Colin, just let me know how the photo's looking to you. I'm going to work from, I might work from this close up, just because I can see a little bit more detail. It's a bit bright. I had that feeling too. Okay, so let me bring down the brightness a little bit. Oops, wrong picture. Is that feeling a little bit more close? I noticed I started to be able to see some details in these areas. What about the color temperature? Is it too yellow? Is it too, is it just about right? The color balance, I could take out some of the red. My feeling is that it was a little too red. Does it still need to be a little bit darker? It could be that I just need to bring down maybe the lights, but not the shadows. Yours is overall a bit cooler. All right, so let me just play with that a little bit. I'll pull maybe just a little more pink or more blue. How's that? It looks more accurate to the picture too. Okay, so let's just go with this. So, because what I wanted to talk to you mostly about was edges, actually. Your colors look really nice. And so I think, and your drawing is pretty spot on. I don't see much that needs adjusting that way. So one thing that's jumping out at me is the edge on the lip. And maybe a touch of this edge here on the nose. So, and a couple of like small transitions, like right here, very subtle changes. So let's just go ahead and jump right into the paint over, because there aren't many major drawing corrections. So I think with the lip, I realize that there's like a good amount of contrast there. So sometimes what I like to do, because the lip does have more of a rounded form, is I like to go in and tile along the vermilion of the lip, right where it transitions, a color that's somewhere between the two before I get that nice bright light that hits above the lip. And you can actually see that she has more like cool mid-tone as the lip kind of curls back into that corner. So that also helps us transition this area, and I see you have some of that. But that little bit of change, you can see how it's really rounding out that form a little bit and giving her more of a full lip rather than usually you get harder lines on thinner lips as we get older. But even still, you'll see softness there. But when we make the lines too hard around the mouth, it ages the subject a bit. Another thing is to take just little spots like that and make sure you have some level of like a cooler pink in the lights, because you have such a rich red shadow. And I think you could probably push it. You have the right shape to your shadow. I think you could probably push the value of that dark a little bit more solid and simplified. We don't see a lot of detail within the shadows for a reason. There's a lack of light. So oftentimes we try and put detail in that we actually can't quite see. And then look for like some of these little connections where there's that little, in the cupid's bow of the lip, a little break in that form. And that's giving her a more full feeling upper lip, giving it the softness that it needs. She has that tiny, tiny bit of reflected light right in here. And if you feel like you can go in with the brush small enough, you might consider adding it. I'm thinking maybe it's more about adding a darker accent, a subtle darker accent above. Like a core shadow, that's what it is. And sometimes when you pay attention to some of these nuances, it really adds a lot of interest to the portrait. Sometimes we can't paint big enough to where we can get that in there. Maybe go darker with this outer corner. But you can see how having that subtle but dramatic dark for the upper lip makes a big difference. And then I think her bottom lip just got a little skinny. I think it has more to do with pushing this up a little bit. So that almost did it exactly, but not that we want to exaggerate that, but it gives her a little bit more of a pout. But notice that as this form on this side of the lip rounds over, it takes on a cooler, deeper value. So maybe start to push that. She has like that deeper, I can actually even pull this color that you have in there. This can come down just a little bit on that left side too. I like that red you had there though. It was a nice saturated red. It just needed to pull down a little bit. And we're giving her more fullness to that lip. You have these really nice kind of cool pinks. I think your color's pretty spot on. I would just, clarify some of your edges, and as it sinks back into this corner, it gets ever so slightly darker. And I would even maybe emphasize it just a touch. That way it doesn't feel like it's getting too light too quick. And it will help you because you won't have to go so bright with this little rim light here that comes in. There's a specular light there, but by pushing that contrast into that corner, it helps. Yeah, go ahead and post your question. Something to note too is if you push that corner of the mouth on this side darker, you will probably have to tile in a little bit more of that green-gray and spread it out a little bit more on that far side to get that lip to transition. And maybe go a little cooler further in. She doesn't really get real light on her muzzle until after the philtrum, so go a little cooler gray in this whole section right here and a little darker, and it's going to push that muzzle over like it's going to capture that plane change in the muzzle, and you can use that half shade of the green to soften the edge of that lip where it is so dark. Regarding her top, how much detail? Oh, do you mean her shirt? I'm going to get into that next, or in our next week's lesson. Actually, sorry, I'm sending that out like Tuesday. So I'll talk a little bit about that. But at the moment, I would go for more large form. But detail in the fabric, it doesn't really matter until you've, in my opinion, you don't want to go and detail an area until you've, especially on like a head and shoulder, like what we're doing, it's so cropped in that if you really, really detail the shirt, it could detract from the portrait. It kind of depends on how you're balancing things out. So I would just say you can hold off and concentrate on the face. And you can even work on the hair because I released the hair video today and continue developing more detail in the hair before you worry about the shirt. There are some tonal changes, but no detail of the fabric. Yeah, like in her shirt, let me pull up the other reference or your other painting. Yeah, when it comes to detail in the shirt, we'll probably leave it somewhat minimal, but we will make maybe some more textural suggestions, but not necessarily detail every like ribbed stripe in her shirt. You know, just enhance it where it shows up and then let things fall away. Okay, so you can see the difference that adding those forms in the lips is going to make. So I would just work and maybe bring those colors a slightly cooler than what you had, and pushing that contrast. I think you could also push some of the contrast in the cast shadow under the nose, which will help. What it's going to do is help make the form shadow on this part of the nose feel more like a reflected light by going darker with your cast shadow. But you will want to pay attention to your edges around your cast shadow because they get more gray and soft as they get further from the source. So there's going to be like a slight gradation from that cast shadow to the skin tone. And especially on this little tail end here, it really, really just fades off. It gets really warm in here too. Let's see. Working in the larger planes of the face, you want to watch some of these transitions like here and here, or wherever you perceive kind of a line forming. And she has maybe a little bit more of a gray that you could maybe enhance right through here. So that could be a color that you make, like a grayish green, that you use as if you use it through this cool zone, it's going to enhance where you have your warm zones. And you might find yourself having to just re-wet a little bit of the shadow edge so that you can blend that gray and not have a real hard edge form on you when you're touching up those areas. But don't be afraid to push that cool, because all it's going to do is complement and enhance those nice warm tones that you have. And if you look at a lot of the Dutch masters, they really emphasize this, and it really works well. It creates that kind of inherent glow to their work. And you have the colors over here in the right side. I just want you to make sure that they're transitioning nice and soft, that you don't have any real rough edges. Even this pink. And then one of the things you can do is just, if you need to transition here to here, make a color that somewhat falls in between, and then do a very thin scumble, oil out, and then do a very thin scumble over it, meaning you're just applying a small amount of paint. Unless you're making a major drawing correction, like this dark line here, you might need to apply a little thicker, so that it covers, any real heavy line. But maybe in like this one here, this is too bright. It's probably going to be a little bit darker, and part of that is the edge work too. It should have a little bit more of a soft transition as it moves across the form. Does that make sense? Yeah, adding those cools makes a big difference. And oftentimes it doesn't feel like natural to want to put such a cool color, and if you did it too much, then it's going to have another effect on the skin, which is make it look a little more dead. But if it's placed smartly and intentionally, all it does is enhance all the beautiful skin tones that you have, like up in here. You have that accurate color, almost exact. So it's just, it can feel washed out, or it cannot show up if you have pink everywhere else. It's by contrast that we see kind of the true nature of something. And maybe over here, I think you could go in probably with some of these pinky kind of lip colors, maybe a slight more saturation right here as it transitions into that warm dark that you have. Don't be afraid to kind of punch that up a little bit. And you could probably even go in and enhance with a paler pink some of these areas, just to break up some of the form so it's not so light so quick. Like pulling in a little gray into that pink up there. Areas we often, because it can feel really bright to us, we over exaggerate some of the light, is in the nose. So if you can, look for areas where you can, again, enhance the pink. Sometimes it's just in a small area, like the transition to the shadow. If you go in with a little bit more pink midtone, maybe even a little bit more of a saturated red, see how that added some more volume to the nose? Yeah, so that's pretty much it. Just keep going over. I'd say the mouth and the muzzle is where a lot of the concentration in development should be. And then you can go in and start enhancing the eyes after that. Do you have any questions? I really like this angle on the model. I almost chose this one for my demonstration too. It's a really nice kind of soft kind of feeling of a portrait. It's not as directional, or it has a more subtle dynamic quality. So I'm glad someone painted it. All right, good. So if you have any questions that pop up midweek, just reach out. Nice work, Colin. Okay, Stella. Now I know you said you had painted, and I think you said you had wiped everything out. Or there was some area. Let me read your email real quick, because oh, Did you send me an update? Let me take a look here. Ah, you got me a close-up. Okay. Okay, I'm transferring it over here. Just give me 1 second. Nope, that's not what I meant to do. I wanted to insert a video or a picture. There we go. All right. So this is the one you're talking about, right? First, it feels a little bit bright. No, it's okay. These things happen. Okay, so let me bring down the brightness here. You tell me when it looks pretty good. I feel like maybe I need to go into the curves and kind of, it feels like it got a little hot in the highlights there. Does that feel a little better? What about color? Temperature, does it feel... Okay, that's it? Okay. Is it too warm? Okay, good. All right, so do you want to explain a little bit of what happened? So you had painted kind of, you started the second color layer or third color layer, and then you ended up wiping it off? I can go over some of your previous... Let me get rid of that one here. Just real quick, let's go back up to last week here, because we had gone over quite a few things. I'm just looking at some of the changes I had suggested last week. And then let me look at this. Okay. It looks like you have a pretty decent likeness. So what was happening? You were having fun. That's good. Spent a long time, got really into it, and then you realized you had painted your cousin. That's funny. Sometimes we do that subconsciously. And they say we always paint a little bit of ourselves into our piece too. I get people commenting, and I'll be painting someone who looks very little like me, and they'll say, "Is this a self-portrait?" So it happens. Okay, so let me zoom in here on her reference so we can talk a little bit about some of the likeness. So I'll do a line layer, and then we'll do a paint over. Okay. Yeah, it happens sometimes. I mean, that's one of the reasons, Stella, that I keep my sketch from the transfer from a long time ago, because I've had it to where I got a painting to a certain stage, and I just felt like I was just stuck in this loop where I kept making the same mistakes over and over again, or it had gotten so far off that it looked nothing like my original drawing, or I'd lost some essential kind of element, and instead of fighting that, I retransfer and I just start again. I'm not saying that you have to do that. I don't think yours is that far off, but it happens, and sometimes it's a mental thing that we get stuck in. It's a psychological, and in those cases, I say just sometimes a fresh start just feels good, and it helps you kind of feel a little more free to take a second stab at the painting. I have a painting that I've been working on, and I decided that I really wasn't happy with the scale of it because it was fighting me a little bit. And so I decided I'm just going to scrap all, even though I've done all this work on the smaller version, and I want to bring it up a little bit in scale. So, excuse me. So sometimes, that happens as well. But what's nice is I do have my original drawing from that smaller painting, and I could actually take that drawing and scale it up either by gridding it, or I could also take just the actual sketch and go down and have it blown up a little bit larger to the size I need. So you can also, do things like that too. That's probably what I'll end up doing, is just scaling it up a little bit. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some of the drawing corrections first. They're really subtle. I'd say what I'm seeing is something in this mouth here. I'm going to draw it in white. Maybe it'll show up a little better. I think where you have this lip coming down, it needs to drop a little bit lower. Almost like that. And that's going to bring that shadow down just a little bit. I can sense where you have this opening, and that feels about right. This side of the lip could use a little more fullness when you get into adding the pink. And I'll do a paint over and show you what that will look like. Now, one thing I do like is all of this texture that you have. You're kind of taking on some like Rembrandtian texture, and one of the things that texture will do as you move up in layers is enhance with glazes. So just keep that in mind. It's not a bad thing, but it can be utilized to your advantage if you want to have like wrinkles or those types of things. Okay, so I would say that is the main one in the mouth. I feel like we lost maybe some width here. In the jaw. Or maybe just some of the clarity of where that sits. So I'm thinking this is where you intended it to be, but maybe it just needs to be enhanced a little bit. And even that feels maybe a touch narrow. And that could be part of the problem too, is that maybe she's getting too narrow through here, and so it's not looking like her as much. I would say even this side, she has that cast shadow, but her jaw actually continues back behind the hair. So you could make this little cast shadow lighter, or just eliminate it completely and just have a real thin one right next to the hair. So I would look at that, and then I'm kind of sketching and feeling my way through this. You could also check these distances just with some measurements and see how they compare from the photo. See how they look almost equal in the photo, and maybe they're slightly off from in the picture. So maybe we can narrow this just a touch. So all that means is that maybe you need to open up the dark on the hair a little wider. Her neck is probably coming down here, and you just need to make sure you have a nice, clean, reflected light there with a real dark accent back here to make sure that you can see that edge. And it could have just gotten too lost, and it's also kind of squishing the forms this way. You're wanting to pinch your shadows in because you can sense the width of the shadows, but maybe the width of the face was a little off. And it should continue to widen just slightly through here. I kind of sense her face is a little bit on the rounder side, so just when you go in and you define this shape in here too, continue that out towards the cheekbone so it fans out just a little bit. And then you could probably pull her shadow. I can sense you almost were starting to do that. And then her chin kind of comes down. I think you have it in the right spot. Your shadow here feels good. Maybe it just needs to dance in a little bit right through there. Yeah, this is what I'll probably send. Well, I'll send you both the paint over and the overlay, but I think since most of them are drawing corrections that you want to make, then I'll send you this for sure, just by itself. And actually, you can even sketch in a little bit where these lines are. If you do it with like a little bit of a, like if you wanted to sketch this line in, take the color from here, this green gray, and sketch in that line. Does that make sense? So you're putting the right color pretty much in the spot. Like this section right here to here should be that gray color that we see right in here. So you're going to basically take this segment and make it that gray color. Let me look at the eyes here. And even her nose, maybe just a few changes in the nose. I feel like you're pretty good with where you have the position of the nose, but I think this part dips down too much. You'll notice that on her, this dip of the septum ends here, and then she has a tiny little cast shadow. Like it comes like this, and then there's like this little cast shadow shape. So I think that needs to come up. The nostrils come down from that. So if we look at where that sits, should be there. So that should be the septum, and then the little cast shadow comes down like that. And there's the other nostril, which is more vague. And the wings of the nostrils should come down to the same height because her head's pretty level. But I think that's, it's not that you had it really in the wrong spot, it's just that you want to make it a little more obvious with the light and the dark. Maybe you've also made her nose just a little bit kind of round like this. She has a little bit more of an angular nose. So you have this angle. So I think it would be good for you to cut in just a little bit, and then right around this break, join in with where you have the bridge. So just pinching that in just a touch. It's going to give her that alkaline nose shape that she kind of has. These are really tiny tweaks, but they're going to kind of add up to getting her likeness. This cast shadow, I realize there's kind of like this double shadow effect that's happening. But if we go with based on this, it lines up with her pupil. So that could be brought out a little bit more. And I bet you pinched it because of where this shadow edge was. And even this shape kind of comes in, and cast shadows always follow the form that they're sitting on. So notice, pay attention to like how it's kind of scooping here. And that's also imitating, you know, that, I don't know exactly what her nose looks like in profile, but I bet that there's a slight arc here right through this part of the bridge, and that's what also is coming across on that side. Kind of bring in a little more of a soft arc to that brow. That one feels pretty good, though you could probably make it a little less, it doesn't need to come down this low, it kind of ends here. I realize that's probably mid-tone down there too though. All right, I'm looking at the eyes now. I'm just kind of jumping back and forth. I think this eye got a little too open. I'll draw it in white just so it's a little easier for you to see. I think it could be brought down just a little bit right through this middle part. I think where you have the corner of the eye seems pretty good. So I would just taper that down. It'll help it align with that right eye a little bit more. And that's pretty much what I'm seeing. The irises might be a little big, but I can't tell if it's just that you need to develop the form around the eyes a little bit more. Okay, so do you want me to just send you this, or would you like me to do a paint over as well? The paint over would basically just be more on color, because it looks like, because you've had to wipe it back, it's gone a little more monochrome. Yeah, okay, perfect. All right, let's go ahead and do that. First, I'm going to leave this sketch up so that I can see where to place some of these grays. So if you go in with that gray green, it's going to come into this shape here, and look for where it pulls across the form. And you can also use it to kind of help connect these two shadows where they kind of pull together a little bit. It even pulls into the mouth, definitely pulls into the chin. And it even serves as a kind of a middle connection to into the eyes here, across this cheek. Then we can take your shadow color. So if you take a real nice rich red brown, you could use probably, you could even make this color using red oxide and a little ochre. If you have red oxide, it's a really beautiful color, and that should give you that nice red orange that you have down here that for that reflected light. And you want to start off with it lighter along that jawline. Okay, make sure I'm doing that on the right layer. And there's even a bit of that down in the neck here. Then you have this darker brown, which could be created with the burnt sienna and blue, or you can even make it with the cad red, yellow ochre, and blue. If you have red oxide, you could also use that, but it has a tendency to be more transparent. It's not good for making drawing changes because it's unless you add an opaque color to it like the ochre. But you go in with a more opaque dark brown. You might even still have some of that color mixed up, and start to shape some of that. There isn't a real dark line down here, it's just that it gets slightly lighter just towards the edge, and it doesn't spread up very far. It's just like it hugs that corner. And then we have the dark of the hair, which we need to bring over. And that goes really dark, so that'll be kind of your darkest dark. And that slowly kind of creeps into the neck here. We can see where the neck starts, but it slowly kind of fades into that. So let's remove some of the lines now. Okay, so that looks very tiled, as you can see. And that means you'll probably want a color that's somewhere between that shadow and that green. It's going to be a little darker. And this could be where, you know, some of the shift happened for you. And then, of course, you're kind of looking further into where it feels like the forms are pulling over. And you'd want, you know, your nice kind of soft edges, but you can see how that's helping to widen that jaw. And it gets darker as it sinks back, so maybe that edge becomes a little less obvious for that jawline. It even becomes less obvious right through here. There's this little area right above the muzzle that where this shadow kind of pulls in. Not everybody has that real obvious shape, but she definitely does. So make sure you look at those areas where you see the colors kind of pull over. And you know, actually, I think I see something in this chin shape where it could be a little more square. Where this plane change happens, it's like right there where that corner is. I think it was getting too rounded out. And of course, she has more of that shadow shape. And we talked about moving the mouth down. Yeah, so you can see it's a small amount, but then this color is going to shrink that just a little bit. We almost lose her edge of her lip with that dark green. the edges become very, we get those lost edges, and it gives a softness to her mouth. Okay, so the next transition color is moving out of that green, and it goes into like kind of a deep mauve tone. And that's what you'll use in this halftone area here. And then slowly it gets warmer and more peachy as you move towards the light. But it's very gradual, so you want to make sure you have enough of those steps, and it goes from kind of being a cool mauve to more of an orange tone. I'm going to leave it a little bit more tiled, just so you can kind of see the individual colors, but just remember that you're going to want it more blended. And then as it gets up to her eyes, because she's so fair, you can see how it turns purple again. Almost like a alizarin, like an alizarin pink right up here. And it takes on some blues as well, kind of around the lids. Maybe this could be narrowed just a little bit. I would wait to put on that real strong light that you see here, and I would just start off with maybe a slightly darker tone so that you can build some of those softer nuances. Until you're kind of towards the final color layers, and then you can go in and hit that with a little bit of light just in that corner. She picks up some of those peachy tones in the darker range right in here as well, just underneath that cast shadow. But don't forget that there's a lot of those cools in this area as well. Because it's the other side of that muzzle. Yeah, it can be overdone, so in that mouth area, like that little light here. So I always say build up to it slowly, because it can also become a point of distraction, which we don't want. So then same thing, you're kind of following the similar color pattern down in the chin. Has the green, but because it's a bony mass, it's probably not going to be as soft as like what you get in some of these upper areas. And then you get more of those pinks in this lower chin. When you get into the nose, let's bring up our line drawing here. I'll show you what putting in that shadow, getting that shadow shape. Maybe I'll grab a little bit closer to the color you have. So just cutting that in a little bit and then going out with your cast shadow, and then I'll carry some of this tone just up here so you can see that shape difference there. Let's get rid of that line now. So and even though that edge is really hard, you can see how that's taking on her nose shape a little bit more. The nose also has these transitions, but there maybe isn't as much green. There will be some, especially up towards the top of the bridge, but it's going to actually take on more of the rosy pinks in general. Like if you look at the nose as kind of a mass tone, it takes on a little bit more of that color. It gets a little bit deeper and more chromatic right as the form is about to turn. That was maybe a little bright. That's what I was looking for. So it has more of this tone to help transition that form towards the shadow. Okay. And it's often, we're a little afraid to put the nose like so chromatic, but it can help a lot. We often just go too pale with it. It doesn't mean you're not going to go in and add those lighter kind of zones, but start off with those slightly more chromatic. It's easy to tone things back. It's much harder to try and start off too dull. And she, of course, has that little split in the nose that not everybody has this. It's a very distinct feature, so that's going to help get her likeness. But you can see how there's that kind of hottish pink color picking up in a few areas around this nostril. So don't be afraid to push those as well. And then as the lights get lighter on her, they get a little bit more of a pale pink. Okay. All right, so are there any other areas you want me to address? I think this was the kind of big one right here, but I think once you get this side established here, moving over into the right side is going to be really easy, because the biggest transitions exist in this half of the face. They're the hardest ones. I mean, you're always, of course, you're going to have those even more rich chromatic reds in the lips, you know, that sort of thing. But yes, I can send you the Procreate file. Sure. Let me just make a note of that real quick. Just make a note up here. Oops. So you have Procreate, so you can, and it should show you the layers, so you can kind of play with that. Okay, just make a note for myself so that way when I email it to you, I remember to send you that version. Do you also want just the JPEG or just the Procreate file? Oh, were you? How fun. Yeah, you know, I actually worked with another program, but this was early on when this was just starting to become a thing, like sketching on the iPad, and they just weren't as good. This one is very intuitive. It's a very intuitive app for a traditional painter who does not know how to do digital painting whatsoever. My attempts at digital painting have been scary at best. So this is a very intuitive program, I feel, for traditional painters. Yes, it was ArtRage, I think. I had actually I was on I was working on a project for an advertisement for ArtRage when it first came out, and they had me doing a painting, and they wanted us to do a digital painting of a portrait, and I had never done it, and it wasn't as intuitive as this, and it didn't have the pressure sensitivity, and they wanted me to create a painting as good as what I do with oil digitally, and it was a disaster. So I ended up just doing an actual oil painting and then letting them put the highlights on digitally. And it never ended up becoming a commercial, but yeah, it was quite an interesting thing. But as soon as I started working with Procreate, I said, oh, this is very natural for a traditional artist to kind of transition to. And the brushes you can get and the resources, the free brush packs you can buy, they're really, really great. Yeah, it's an excellent program. And they keep adding really cool features. Like they just recently updated and they've added like perspective. You can actually put a perspective grid in. You can, like now when you make a circle, you can just hold it and it will make, you know, you can scale your circles, which is great for when you're planning, you know, you're trying to make something. And they've added text now, like a text feature, so you can actually put in text. So I use it a lot. It really needed the text because sometimes just doing the handwritten stuff doesn't work that great. All right, Stella, if you have any follow-up questions, just let me know. This is looking good. I know you kind of had a bump in the road, but I think if you kind of push that shadow over, you're going to get her likeness again and you can move forward. I'm glad you were having fun though. That's the most important part. You're welcome. All right, Marianne, are you in here? I had emailed you, Marianne, about the image. So if you're in here, just let me know. Just so everyone kind of knows, Marianne had sent me a picture. I think I have, no, I don't have your last week one. And you had to shoot in low light to try and not get glare. But the problem with low light is we get kind of a grainy effect, and it also made her I know your skin tones are more vibrant than this because I remember seeing your painting last week and you had these really beautiful bright skin tones. So I know that this is not an accurate representation of your painting. So what I'd like to do, and I think I sent you an email yesterday, is just have you email me a picture in just regular daylight. It's okay if there's a little bit of glare. And, you know, I suggest taking your painting even outside into the shade of like a tree, or if you have a covered patio, just sometime when the sun isn't directly hitting or like glaring off the patio, early morning or something like that. Oh, you did email me a picture? Okay. But just, you know, sometimes when I'm having trouble getting a picture in my studio, for like a snapshot, I'll try taking my painting outside under my covered barn, and I'll take a picture there, and just with indirect skylight kind of hitting, and I can usually get a slightly better picture. It depends on the time of year in my studio. I have north light windows, but sometimes the light hits. There's like a grapevine on the other side of my window, and sometimes when it's I forget which time of year, I think it's late summer, the sun actually beams in just at an angle. Even though I'm north facing, it just kind of glances in and it hits that green and it lights my studio kind of green. So I kind of keep my shears up, my sheer curtains closed, so it kind of filters some of that and cools off the light again. But you know, sometimes I have to get creative too with trying to capture a good shot. Okay. I am not seeing another one from you. You sent a DSLR earlier when the critique started. All right, I'm refreshing my email really quick, but I am not seeing it here in my emails. Hang on just a second. Because I had checked before our class started to see, and I didn't. So I didn't receive it, Marianne. I don't know if you can try sending it again really quickly, but doesn't look like I received it. I'm checking my other email just in case you sent it to that one, my other email address. I do have, I mean, I have a close-up of this, but it was shot in low light. But that one was sent yesterday, or Yeah, yesterday. You just sent it again? Okay, let me check. I realize this is one of the biggest like hoops we have to jump through for doing long distance, you know, critiques and that sort of thing. You're sending it to my contact at leeartstudio.com, right? So you'd wiped it all off and started again? Okay. I haven't quite received it yet. Yeah, it's weird because I'm searching your name and I'm not even seeing it come up as under like an archived email. But I have been getting emails, but from other students, so it's not my email address that's having an issue. Okay. Um, I hate to do this, but I actually I have to go meet with the sheriff. I don't know if some of you have heard, but my studio got broken into, and there's been a development. So I'm hopeful, but I actually have to go meet them at 5:15. So um, at my studio. So Marianne, since we can't get yours through, um, why don't you continue to try and email it to me? If not, try posting it in the forum, and you and I can connect, and I can do a paint over. Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, it's been a little bit of a crazy week. So yeah, let's try to keep sending it to me, or if you can't get it to send, post it in the forum, and we'll kind of connect. We can. Why don't you write me a different email, or you can even try messaging me on Facebook or Instagram, and we will see if we can either reconnect, do a quick little critique like this, or I can do a paint over and send you my suggestions. But you will get a makeup critique, okay? Sorry for the technical issues. I just didn't want to give you a lot of feedback on this photo because I know your painting has better color than that, and I wouldn't want to, you know, tell you to change all these things when it's really not necessary. Especially since you said you wiped it down. So let's do that, okay? All right, guys. Thank you so much for tuning in. And since I have to run, I'm going to send you your edits, but it might not be for another maybe 2 hours until I get back, just because I have to run real quick. So just keep an eye out, and I will send you your edits so you guys can start working tomorrow. Okay? All right. I hope you guys enjoy the lesson on hair. It's really fun. And of course, just write in this forum if you guys have questions. Nice work, everyone. Thank you, Brenda. Yeah, I'm hoping too. I just got, they asked to come see us. I guess there was some other incident related. They think it might be the same person. I don't know the details, so I'm hoping. It'd be nice to get my equipment back. But who knows what condition it could be in too, so we'll see. I don't know the details yet. So anyhow, thank you guys, and have a lovely weekend. All right. See you next week.